yeah, the working group activities which will determine the balance between the different objectives of the farm, of which there are clearly a few, the environmental, economic, and the social. So I will not hold you up anymore. I will start the presentation. I'm on share screen, right? I know I can do it. And just, Chris, if you let me know that you can see the pres.
Yeah, I can see that.
Great, thanks. Okay, excuse me while I get familiar with. As Chris has outlined, the Kindling Farm, which will be an organic farm, is going to use an agroforestry system to produce food. And I'll discuss that a little bit in a little bit more detail. The farm's located between Manchester and Liverpool, so it has very large markets and a very large surrounding area of market. Excuse me, hang on a minute. Sorry. Okay, I don't think so. Anyway, sorry, someone thought I was showing text rather than the slides themselves. This is the view of the larger part of the farm. There are the farm buildings, and then behind those are two of the fields included. As Chris says, about 78 acres overall, about 74 acres of which are arable, or at least farmland available for the various activities that will food production, agroforestry that will happen there. This is the property in outline, the yellow boundary marking the four main fields. As you can see across them, there are, well, you can't see that they're ponds, but there are various ponds. There's one in each field, and there are several across this landscape. We're not entirely sure. Chris has determined that they were there before 1900, but we're not entirely sure of their purpose, drainage, irrigation, holding water for irrigation, something that could be determined, I'm sure. So what is agroforestry? Put simply, it's basically growing trees on farms. And trees can be in hedgerows, they can be grown in lines as windbreaks, also in shelter belts. They can be mixed into pasture to provide shade and fodder for cattle. You can grow them in small copses, which have ecosystem engineering benefits. And as well, you can have production, orchards, so fruit orchards that can house sheep and hens. Pretty much any combination that you can imagine of trees in farms to any density, as long as food is being produced, trees are being grown and productive, whether that's as food or as fodder or as fiber, that's agroforestry. There are various systems, but the two key systems are silvo-arable, which is mixing trees with food production, crop production, and silvopastoral, which is largely livestock. Kindling Farm was going to incorporate, use a silvo-arable agroforestry system, and the trees will be fruit trees, apple, pear, and the like, and they will be grown in rows with large alleys between for cropping vegetables and cereal crops. So, agroforestry actually is very, very old, thousands of years. It's been practiced, not just because thousands of years ago clearing land to make fields was a big problem, but it had its own benefits. And I guess in the 50s, with industrialization of land use and the separation of agriculture, forestry, fruit production, agroforestry practices have fallen by the way. It's become, everyone is now more or less convinced and recognized, and research is supporting the fact that agroforestry is a very productive system, particularly if you're concerned about the long-term productivity of the system. Monoculture cropping has many disadvantages, but a diverse cropping system has many advantages, and we'll look into that. Some of them are that it is in the true sense more sustainable. So the area of land that you're farming can support the production of food on a long-term basis, in a way that is economically viable. And in the case of the organic food production and the vision of Kindling Farm, it would also be environmentally beneficial rather than damaging, and also socially beneficial. There are many reasons for this. I'll touch on it in a moment. The ecology of this system means that it works better than artificial systems which rely on artificial inputs. More consistent yields, more reliable yields, and trees also add an extra crop. They also use the area above the soil. So you are farming in 3 dimensions on a farm which maybe you're only looking for a cover, a perennial crop or a cereal that is 1 dimension. And of course, the trees can comprise fruit trees, nut trees, and they can also produce fiber and wood products as well. Agroforestry systems also are beneficial when it comes to biodiversity, and that is the key. I'll touch on that in a moment. It's a key reason to be here. And as mentioned, there reduce pest problems. I'll give a bit of a background on that. I won't spend too much time on it. It's a subject worthy of a lecture series in itself. But the more the biodiversity, the more resilient and the healthier and the more productive the system, and the more that you have a balance between natural ecological processes and the agricultural processes, which are also ecological. And then there are wider environmental benefits of introducing trees onto farms. They help regulate water flows to the system, so reduce flooding and also reduce drought, manage surface runoff, reduce the amount of leaching of the soil, and thereby pollution of watercourses. In addition, of course, they are sequestering carbon from the atmosphere and locking up it in trees, so it helps mitigate the effects of climate change. So what is biodiversity? I think everybody thinks they know what it is, and or has a feeling for what it is. As a scientist, we like to think of it in terms of what we can measure, but essentially it is the diversity of life. Broken down, we think of that in terms of the individuals. There's diversity across the individuals if you think about genetic diversity, but the individuals of a species diversity is 1 dimension. Within a population, there's diversity at the population level as well. In some species live in subpopulations called metapopulations, and how they operate is also a contribution to biodiversity. And of course, species interact in particular ways. They become co-evolved and they interact in communities, and the consequences, the interactions and the consequences of those interactions are part of biodiversity. So essentially, the rule of thumb, the phrase is it's the diversity of life, but then life is everything that we see, everything we understand about species and how they interact, and measuring it, however, as I've indicated, as scientists and need to do, tends to focus on certain elements. I'll come back to that towards the end of the talk. Why is biodiversity so important? In a way, it's a daft question, because biodiversity is life, and life is important to life. If we didn't have throughout a food web, if you didn't have the primary producers that are taking sunlight and turning it into energy that we can use, and if we didn't have the detritivores, which are converting dead matter into usable nutrients, if we didn't have insects that are pollinating and are prey for food and are parasitizing and therefore helping to control pest species of other insects and invertebrates, we wouldn't be here. And essentially, biodiversity or the lack of it determines the extent to which we human beings, but any form of life, can enjoy life and can prosper and thrive. But how's it doing? I mean, we know the story. I'm just going to flick through some very recent statistics, which I'm afraid obviously are not going to be particularly positive. It's just to make the point, in particular in relation to the farmland here, that biodiversity is not doing very well. This is data from BTO, fairly recent data, which shows that amongst farmland birds populations, and this is since 1970, and by the way, 1970 is the baseline because that's where reliable data exists. And we had an index of 100 in 1970, and then the trends are in relation to that. If you go back 20 or 30 years before 1970, I can be fairly sure that the farmland bird populations were even higher than the 100. So this decline is not indicating the overall pattern since industrialization of agriculture in the last, since the 30s, 40s. As we can see, farmland birds in general are not doing very well. Generalists are able to switch to different food and different habitat types and survive better, but there is a statistical decline, and specialists are doing even less well because their habitat and the things that they rely on are in decline as well. Flying insects, I'll come back to that. Most pollinators are flying insects, and flying insects are not doing well at all. These data are from Germany, and their survey of over that 25-year period of the abundance. So that's the insect biomass is the total mass of insects, and you can roughly equate that to the abundance, the population size. It's a 75% drop in the biomass of insects in nature reserves in Germany, and this is repeated in across Europe and across the world. But it's basically food for everything that relies on, that sits above the insects in the food web. And that 75% decline is bound to have a massive impact on species that are dependent on insects. But not just the predators and parasitoids, it's also those species that depend on insects for pollination and other ecosystem services that they perform. And not just insects, this study is about insects, but about invertebrates generally, including in the soil, not just above ground. And I'll whiz through these. Butterflies in the UK, it's again since the mid-70s, where there was a significant drop, and there's been a trend in decline. These are recent data. It's all going in the wrong direction. And this is to a great extent to do with habitat loss, habitat simplification, the use of pesticides, artificial fertilizers, the footprint of human beings. And it's essential that we reverse those trends. And Kindling Farm will, in its small way, and perhaps not so small, relatively contribute to that reversal, that restoration of biodiversity. What I want to do now is, as this is the initial, we've had an initial look. We're creating a baseline. What's going on the farm now? What is the baseline position? Our number one, our 100 in those indices. What does it look like now, and how are we going to improve? How are we going to enhance, restore, increase biodiversity on the farm? There is a great diversity of habitats on the farm, existing habitats and features that can be restored and enhanced, and there are also many opportunities for habitat creation and connection across the farm, and also beyond the farm. The Kindling Farm vision allows for what I would call a generous approach to making space for nature. It is one of the primary outcomes of the farm. One of its success measures will be the enhancement of biodiversity. and generous. Essentially, in many farms, commercial farms, industrial commercial farms, anyway, they have, you know, they're very reluctant to spare land for non crop production purposes as the technologies they use require. Whereas Kindling Farm can be generous, and I'll talk a little bit about that as we go through different habitats and different opportunities. But of course, it's always a balance. It is a commercial farm. It needs to make a profit, or it needs to make a surplus, let's call it, enough to keep the investors happy. But it also needs to deliver organic food to a larger base of folks in the Manchester, Liverpool area. Do it directly, do it affordably, and as well as engage those communities in the work of the farm. So hedgerows are a major feature in the farm. So I'm basically now going to walk through the different habitats just quite quickly, look at what's there, look at what the potential is, and we will start with hedgerows. In the map there, you can see each of the field has got a boundary. That boundary is within the hedgerow. So the hedgerows are lying on the edge, or there's hedgerows all the way around the outer boundary. And then, as you can see, the fields are divided, and there's hedgerows running down each of those. It's a lot of hedgerow. Nearly 4 kilometers of hedgerow exists already. And then more or less halfway across the field, you can see a dark blue line, and they're straight, which is hedgerow that we are considering introducing. So I just point that out for the moment. It wouldn't be a solid line. It needs to be broken because, as you'll see later, how the food production will work on. We need access. As things stand at the moment, the hedgerows are not in great condition. I mean, they're not so bad. They've been heavily cut to maintain them almost coppiced, which is fine if they had been coppiced. That's a way in which to manage them positively. They're also not very diverse in terms of the species in the hedgerow. There are some hedgerows which are all hawthorn, and they actually make up the majority. So there is a massive weighting towards hawthorn, whereas we would expect, and we will plan to have many more species, up to 10 or 15 species. There's some blackthorn there, as you can see in that top left image. The other thing that's clear from this is that our baseline for the farm is it's being managed very close to the hedgerows. There's very little grassland, maybe 0.5 meter, and that's just mixture of ryegrass, and you can see very little of what we call refill margin. I'll come back to that. That's the current state. As a baseline, that's a very low baseline. I expect that we can see very significant improvement in hedgerows. And one way in which we can do that, and these pictures are of, the one on the left is a more mature part of the hedgerow, which is very nice. It's got honeysuckle, which is in the foreground. It's got bird cherry. It's also got some blackthorn, some purging buckthorn, and hawthorn. But you can also see emergent trees and oak, and then there's more emergent trees from that hedgerow. That's in fairly good shape. That's the kind of thing we might be aiming for. The other two photos are from another site, and this is hedge laying. It's one way in which to manage and improve the hedge. So what okay, can I go backwards? Previous, yeah. So with these hedgerows, the obvious thing to do is first of all to manage them so that when they're cut, so that they're about 1.5 meters wide, 2 meters high. Many of the hedgerows here are much lower. They're much tighter. And the other thing is, particularly for the hedgerows that have been cut short and they've been allowed to grow without any management, they can be coppiced to open them up, and we can start planting other species. Some of the species I've mentioned, to include hazel as well, and flowering plants. We can ensure that we put plants in there which will then flower throughout for as long a part of the season, early and as late as possible, providing nectar and pollen for insects and vertebrates, and food for birds. That's one obvious thing to do, is to enrich the hedgerows that we already have and then manage them so that they're taller and they're wider. With the hedgerows that will be planted, this is something that we'll be able to do from the get-go, and they'll be managed they're going through the field, so they'll be managed well so that they fit within that working environment, but we'll have the opportunity there to get off on the right foot and have the right mix of species. But over a longer period of time, these hedgerows here can be managed, they can be adjusted to increase the diversity of species and to increase the volume, which is essentially a habitat for a huge number of insect species, invertebrate species, but small mammal species. Later, when we talk about field margins, if you introduce a decent area 2 meters out from the hedgerow at least, which will have tusky grassland and wildflowers, you're creating the habitat that barn owls need, and kestrels, and essentially these habitats which are linear and they're large area are phenomenally important. I've mentioned the field margins, and if you focus here, this slide you'll see again later, it's showing various things about the farm. These lines I'll come back to, but these margins here, field margins are, now I'll go through to the next slide so that you can see, we have a hedgerow, mature hedgerow, and then there is a margin which is not, this is in regular agriculture, but a margin that is not managed. And indeed, you should, careful management of the cropping area will reduce significantly, ideally to zero, pesticide or fertilizer contamination of this area. I'll call it contamination because effectively that's what it is. Similarly, on this hedge, which is fairly low, you've got a margin that's got mixed wildflowers. Generally speaking, the larger the margin, the better. And obviously, there's a limit to how large it can be. Otherwise, it's impacting too much on the production, the area for producing productive crops. But between 2 and 6 meters, depending on the feature that it's around, and the hedgerows, it tends to be 2 to 3 meters of field margin, provides a large area of very valuable habitat to support a lot of biodiversity. I mentioned, the barn owls and kestrels, and but also bats, because of the invertebrates, bats and other birds will benefit from that kind of management. So all of the, if I just go back, so I'm just highlighting these areas here. So a 3 meter strip out from the edge, from the center of the, so it'll be about 2.5 meters of clear field margin from under the hedgerow will be introduced on all of the hedgerows in the farm. Well, I say will be, that's the proposal. It's a working group that has to determine what the best thing to do is. Operational and economic needs might get in the way, but ideally, from a biodiversity point of view, it's a relatively small use area of land which can deliver a massive amount of benefit. And again, across the new hedgerows in the fields, also a field margin. The other feature that I pointed out on the farmer ponds, and there are ponds in every field, and there's the potential for more ponds. These ponds, I shall just I'll jump to, it says there's text there which shouldn't be there, and there's not text that is missing. I've jumped to the ponds here. You can see that they are, round, and they look quite deep. They sit 1 meter to 1.5 meters, the surface of those ponds, below the farm level. My inkling is that it was probably a mixture of drainage, but water regulation, including irrigation across the farm. So these are potentially very interesting areas. They're not particularly well established. They're farmed, as you can see, they're being ploughed right up to the edge. Nevertheless, there are willows, there are some hawthorns, and there are some emerging aquatic plants, and on some of the slopes that aren't so steep, we have some kind of riparian vegetation. It's the kind of thing, it's a great starting point, but the management of these ponds can improve their health and their diversity very significantly. And the kind of thing that will be needed, if I go back to this slide, you can see the inner ring here, which is the margin of the land that's not been ploughed and used for production. And then there is a ring that's around it, which is effectively the margin. So it's a buffer, but it's actually, it's more than just a buffer. It would be a buffer if there were pesticides and insecticides being used here, because it would buffer the contamination of the pond with those. But it's actually, it's a margin, it's habitat, and it's thicker down here. So this is south facing, and because of the steepness of the pond, sun isn't getting into there, so the idea would be to introduce a gradual slope on the southern edges of all of these ponds, perhaps even if we could extend that's a 6-meter ring from here. If that could be extended to 10 meters, something for the working group to think about. We could create marshy areas here, and in one or two of the ponds there are low-lying areas of land here. So if we could be even more generous and extend this area by creating a slope, allowing the light to get down to this side of the pond, which is, it's not receiving much at the moment, but also there's the opportunity for other habitats to be developed, as I say, the wetter and marshy type of habitat. It also gives greater access to birds, amphibians, and although mostly they can manage around here, there are some of these ponds are very, very steep sided. One other option is to increase. I'll jump here, although this is about something else. You can see these are the ponds. There's a pond there. There actually is a pond within there. It's part of a ditch, but it's widened out to a pond, and so on. There are some areas of land here which are very low, and they might be suitable for introducing additional ponds. Certainly the same kind of ponds as currently exist could be produced there by digging deep, but the idea would to find a seasonally inundated area that might become a seasonal pond, which has a different has a different kind of biodiversity, because it dries out seasonally, and so you've got species which are adapted to those kind of environments. Now we're looking at the watercourses. It's not as clear as I would like, but you can probably see blue lines down here. These are drainage ditches, but they run into a stream which has been straightened, and then it becomes more natural along as you go west on the southern edge, and to a very well established stream there. And along the very western edge, going north, there is also a stream which is pretty well established. And then there is a wet and running ditch and drainage ditch here, which moves into a pool. These ditches they're in reasonable condition, but they can be managed in a variety of ways to hold water and to have it running at times of the year, or still, or even semi-dry. And all of those various conditions, which are normal even in drainage ditches and acceptable, will allow a different suite of species to establish themselves. So there's quite a lot of opportunity in this network to create to enhance the ditches and the streams themselves. There's as you can see, this is one of the watercourses which is running fairly freely. Here is a pool within one of them, and then a large pool, and it's literally just a flooded area that's low down, and the stream runs to the side. In fact, that's this one. You can see the stream running to the side of the pool, which is flooded into that area. These are ideal, and if there are opportunities, and I saw one or two, to create and extend these pools, that is also going to have a great deal of benefit for biodiversity overall. Woodland, this landscape, the trees that will be introduced, we'll go to that in a minute, are going to be planted in very regular, very, very operationally prescribed ways. There's very little woodland in this landscape, and so these two areas here in the southwest and the northwest of the property, they're large. The southwest is 1 hectare, that's 2.5 acres, which is a large area to take out of production. It would have enormous benefits in this landscape. Woodland obviously is another kind of habitat, and it is extremely valuable for many of the species already mentioned, bats, and for large preying birds and owls, but also all birds. Huge number of insects use it as a refuge in the winter. It's a place to overwinter. Your ladybirds, they go off and they hibernate in nooks and crannies in trees, not just your house. So I would like to consider the possibility of establishing in this part, because the system of streams, as I pointed out previously, and also these established copses, it makes it an ideal area in which to introduce trees and create a new woodland. Those trees should, ideally, because we want to move things on, it's good to plant trees, but the provenance of the seeds for the oaks and the field maple should be as local as possible. And it's also, it's so heavily used, this field, I doubt there's any natural regeneration going to come out of the field, but we can look for that and support that where it's possible. Otherwise, this would be a straightforward tree planting exercise, albeit though with seed for locally provenanced sourced seed and saplings. And there are oaks, and there are the great variety of trees, the cherry and so on, in the hedgerows and nearby. Unless we want to get going soon, if this woodland creation were to be approved, we might have time to plant this coming November to February. I think that's probably too ambitious, which and even if that might be possible, we might prefer to take the time to gather and germinate local species of trees over the next winter period and plant them in the following year. But they're the two areas. This is just over 0.5 hectare, and they're the most obvious areas to create new woodland. Although not woodland, I've pointed out that emergent trees in hedgerows, and you've seen various, and I'm going to show you a couple now, are also very valuable as habitat. But there is, in this case, there is one lone oak tree. I don't know why it's in that field, but it's very happily, it's been left there. It must be, I think, 150 years, maybe 120, 150 years old. I'm not suggesting that we put more trees in, but that's something, once the production systems have been laid out, there may be opportunities, particularly close in relation to where the ponds are, to put some more lone trees in fields that have their own value. Here's some mature trees in hedge, and there's kilometers of hedge where there are no trees emerging. It's just been cut. So one way in which to, and because those hedges have been planted there, and where they're hawthorn, I don't expect to find young oak saplings trying to push up to the hedge. So we'll probably have to plant trees in the hedge and then encourage them and support them and make sure they don't get cut over the years, so that they can emerge like these examples, which are again very valuable. And so we come more to the agroforestry, the tree rows. So while there is a focus on fruit trees, the initial discussions. So just to be clear, these are proposed lines of fruit trees. These rows are between 27 and 30 meters across. The idea being that there would be a 24-meter span of this land, which would be the alley in which perennial crops would be grown. And the 27 to 30 meters allows for between 3 and 5 meters of land width of here, a strip of land devoted to the trees, and then beneath the trees, wildflower grass mixes, which would altogether with all of these rows amounts to a huge amount of habitat. That habitat, the species you plant can be chosen very carefully so that they are producing, pollen and nectar early in the season to late in the season. They are clearly beneficial pollinators, but they also harbor, or at least they harbor, they're a place in that ecosystem where you have natural predators like parasitic wasps or parasitoids that lay eggs in aphids and lay eggs in caterpillars, larvae of large white butterflies. Underneath the fruit trees, which will bear a crop, we've got a potential for a huge amount of natural and semi-natural habitat to be created, which has enormous benefits not only for biodiversity as a whole, but also for the agroecological system that's being developed here. I don't think I need to say too much more. The discussions here will be what species, how wide are these strips? I would recommend at least 3 meters. 4 meters would be great. Depends on how the trees will be managed. If they're going to be, they're on a root stock, at least the ones that I was help grafting, which will be grown into a robust but not a huge tree. So good for production, but also keeps space here. The alignment is not quite north-south. It's matching the north-south alignment of the trees would minimize the amount of shade that the canopy of those trees would cast onto nearby crops. However, this is operationally going to be a simpler alignment and is not that far off north-south to be a worry, to be a concern for production. So yes, some of the discussion is, Rachel, have you thought about introducing some nut-bearing trees or even some standards? So going back to the lone oak in a field, the infield oak, this may be an opportunity to have, obviously an oak as it matures is going to reduce the number of fruit trees that are going to be productive. So it has a bearing, and we're there trading off the biodiversity benefits from having those trees in that system from the food production benefits. And that's what one of the things that the working group will be paying attention to. But where these trees and strips work, they work really well, and it's very, the research data are robust that show very significant increase. You have species present that wouldn't otherwise be, and you have abundance of those species, the populations and subpopulations of them, which are very healthy. But we don't need to ignore what goes on in the alleys, these areas of land between the trees where crops are being grown. There's plenty of opportunity for growing other species of plants underneath the crops as they mature, including inter-row living mulches, so green manure. It's basically species like clover that will fix nitrogen into the soil. In fact, the bottom picture there is a cover of clover and other species, several clover and other species. So there's great opportunity which I'm less familiar with, and I don't know all of the operational restrictions or implications of suggesting various things, but there's a great opportunity there to enhance the biodiversity within the alleys as they are going through the various crops that we produced on them over the season. And almost finally, the buildings themselves, as you've seen pictures. This is the farmhouse, and then there are various other buildings. There are brick-built buildings that have opportunities, limitations as well, which will gradually be restored and repurposed. And as part of that restoration and repurpose, we can think about biodiversity. There's also various barns and steel frame buildings, again, which will be maintained, repurposed. And again, in that restoration and repurposing, we can look to various enhancements, biodiversity enhancements. And one obvious one of thinking about it is the barn owl. So, barn owls are primarily a farmland bird which hunt for small mammals, whether they are in the strips of land under the fruit trees, or whether they're in the field margins or with the new woodland. They're sensitive to disturbance, so they need boxes and quiet places up in mature trees, within barns, and also on the outside of buildings. The opportunity there is quite significant. Similarly for other birds, like swifts and swallows, that have different requirements, but those buildings, whether you integrate it within the building or you put boxes on the outside of the building, they have great potential for enhancing. And swift, these species are present. Kestrel are also present, and it's possible, although generally speaking, you attach them to trees, kestrel nest boxes as well. And then bats. Bats need places to roost and to overwinter. So you've got daytime roosts, summertime roosts within the new woodland or on the mature trees that are already emerging out of the hedgerows. But also banks of bat boxes on buildings, integrated within buildings, if that's a possibility with the restoration of the buildings. Bats are having a hard time of it, and if we get the biodiversity, if we get these enhancements right, we will be creating a very pleasant habitat, with the watercourse, the hedgerows, very suitable habitat for bats. So we need to ensure that they can stay within the farm, if you like. It doesn't. They have opportunities within the farm to roost over winter as well as overnight. And then I guess the final point is that, Barnhay Farm does not exist in isolation. I've already commented on there's not an awful lot of woodland. There are patches of woodland, as you can see in this image, but that's the property. And in the immediate vicinity, there's lots of farmland. So the biodiversity within this farm can be enhanced and will be enhanced extremely significantly. I've no doubt about that. But it can't exist as an island. It really needs to be well connected across the landscape. Many of the species that we're talking about, whether they're big raptors or they are, small invertebrates or amphibians, they need to move way across the landscapes, far beyond this property. So linking all these initiatives across the landscape will be very important, both by connecting the new hedgerow work and watercourse enhancements and the ponds with adjoining nearby properties, but also beyond that, encouraging within the sphere of influence, leading by example, encouraging farmers and landowners beyond the immediate area, but into the wider landscape to adopt the same, or at least to I'd like to think it will be an exemplary project, so adopt the same kind of biodiversity interventions, but perhaps get creative in their own way, depending on what habitats they have already on their farm. I'm going to wrap up pretty quickly now. One thing to mention is that I talked about a baseline. The baseline is from April 23, and lots of photographs and some surveys are already establishing for various indicators, both species presence and absence. That's a key indicator, and but also habitat and land use type. We need to show that we're achieving the outcomes. So whatever is planned for the interventions, it needs to be planned in a framework that will define meaningful metrics that will show that the outcomes that we are seeking, not just more of a species, but more ecological process, more health, greater resilience. We find metrics and we monitor them in a frequency over the lifetime of this farm, hundreds of years, in the right way. We start off on the right foot. So that'll be another big piece for the working group to grapple with and define. and I will leave it there. I'm going to hand over to Chris now. As you all know, you may already be investors, but if you're not, the farm is in, although the farm's being bought, there is a fundraise, which Chris and Helen can tell you about if that's appropriate. But I will say, I'll say thanks for your attention and open for questions.
Thanks. Thanks, Mike. That was great. If you don't mind unsharing your screen,
Yeah, I'm just trying to.
I'm going to stop recording.
There you go.